This episode is brought to you by AWS. Amazon Q Business is the generative AI assistant that can securely understand your business data, summarize results, and streamline tasks. Learn what Amazon Q Business can do for you at aws.com/learn more.
Welcome to Gabfest Reads for December 2024. I'm David Plotz, one of the hosts of Slate's Political Gabfest. Before his death in 2020, John Lewis could have made a strong case, though he would have been too humble to have made a strong case in this way, that he was the greatest living American, a man whose lifetime of activism and service and physical bravery and moral courage and suffering were an inspiration. Lewis was somebody who inspired. He also did. He did things. He was an incredibly influential figure in the civil rights movement from an extremely young age. He was a speaker at the March on Washington, a founder and leader of SNCC, a congressman, an author, an icon. And now he is subject of a comprehensive biography from one of America's leading modern historians, Rutgers professor David Greenberg. David Greenberg, congratulations on John Lewis, A Life.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And your readers should know I'm old Slate person from the early days. So we go way back.
Yeah, we've known each other forever. In fact, I used to edit your history lesson column back when you were at Slate, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I will note, in fact, maybe this is a challenge for your book editor. Editing you was really easy because I just cut the first paragraph. You always had this throat clearing first paragraph, and I would just cut it. And then that was it. You'd cut the first paragraph and then it was done. Is that what your editor did with this 700-page book?
Well, he did a little more than that, but he actually cut less than I thought. And I kept asking him, are you sure? Don't we need to cut the word count? And he kept saying to me, it doesn't read long. So I trust that. And so far, people who've read the book have shared the same sentiment with me. So even though it's a hefty biography, I think it reads well and doesn't feel difficult to get through. So
the first half of John Lewis, A Life covers his extraordinary decade or so in the civil rights movement, the beginning as the leader of sit-ins in Nashville, Freedom Rides, Freedom Summer, March on Washington. He was shockingly young. He was brave. Where did John Lewis come from, and how did he acquire the kind of moral certainty and courage that allowed him to do all of these things?
It's really a remarkable story. I mean, what possesses this, young man from rural Alabama, raised on a farm in poverty, 9 siblings, raised under the boot of Jim Crow, to sort of find it within himself to become this incredibly influential, consequential, fighter and activist for racial equality. He seems to have had some of this even as a young boy. He would go into town and to get an ice cream at Bird's drugstore, the black kids would have to eat their ice cream outside the store. The whites could be inside. Or at the movie theater, he and his brothers and sisters would have to sit high up in the balcony while the main seating was reserved for whites. And he just felt the inherent unfairness of this. And whereas his parents and a lot of people sort of didn't question, there could be terrible consequences if you stirred up too much trouble. He kind of had it in him early on that he was going to take on this system. And then he goes to Nashville for college, for Bible college. It's the American Baptist Theological Seminary. And there he falls in with a group of kind of Martin Luther King style social gospel ministers. They study Gandhi. They study civil disobedience, the whole tradition of nonviolent activism. And immediately he adopts this philosophy. James Lawson, who was a divinity student and one of the leaders of this group, he died last summer, but I interviewed him for the book, and he said John Lewis was ripe, at age 18 or 19. Even though, he hadn't read Gandhi before, a lot of this was new. Instinctively, this was a philosophy that resonated with him.
There's this amazing quote from Will Campbell, who's a minister. John Lewis, perhaps as much as any man I've ever known, really believes in nonviolence. If you could kill him, I think you could kill him and he wouldn't resist. I don't think this is true of very many people. That is an understatement. So it's not just that he's an activist. He's an activist who so fully absorbs this notion of nonviolence into him. Why? How? And how does it then manifest in his life?
Yes. I mean, it is this remarkable quality, and others besides Campbell noted it in him. He was always willing to be first in the line. I mean, famously at Selma, marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where he then gets his brains clubbed in by state troopers. He was fearless, but it wasn't that he lacked fear altogether. I found what I think must have been his first national press conference. He's with Martin Luther King and James Farmer. It's during the Freedom Rides of 1961 to integrate bus travel at bus stations across the South. And he says very directly, he says, look, I don't want to die. I love life. He's like, but I am willing to die, for the sake of this cause of racial equality, of human equality. And again, where that conviction and that almost serenity in the face of possible death comes from, it is very hard to say. He certainly seems to have had, a strong moral and principled streak from when he was very young. He finds in this Nashville group of fellow students and ministers a community that, inspires him. And I think they sort of collectively feel that they are, as they were, doing the work of history, moving history in the right direction.
There's a phrase that recurs throughout your book, the beloved community. What is the beloved community?
So this is an idea that goes back, really, I think you find it like in the philosopher Josiah Royce. It comes through the social gospel tradition of Christianity, which includes a lot of, Black ministers, in, the tradition that King finds himself in. It's really a name for an envisioned future society, an ideal society, maybe we'll never quite get there, in which conflict is resolved without violence, in which things are resolved harmoniously. There is respect among all people, one for the other, therefore, regardless of race or religion or other distinctions. So it's a term that Martin Luther King used a lot, that James Lawson used a lot, and Lewis sort of makes it his own. And he talks about the beloved community. And in a way, it's also a term he then uses for the communities he finds, first in Nashville and then at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, groups of people who kind of share these ideals and share this desire to work for a better America.
How does Lewis end up speaking at the March on Washington? You think of the March on Washington, probably the most iconic mass gathering in American history. And here's this kid. I mean, he's really a kid who ends up giving a speech. Why did that happen?
Yeah, he's 23 years old. He has really just been named chairman of SNCC a couple months earlier. And SNCC was formed in 1960 after the wave of lunch counter sit-ins that were so effective at bringing attention to segregation, in five and dimes and diners and stuff across the South. The Nashville group that Lewis was a part of was sort of the most successful, the most disciplined, the most steeped in nonviolence and these teachings of Gandhi and others that I've been talking about. And so when there's a vacancy, a guy named Chuck McDew sort of steps down his chair, kind of Lewis is looked to as a natural choice to fill that role. Now, SNCC initially was not so keen on being a part of the March on Washington, but the thing is starting to gain momentum in the summer of 63. John F. Kennedy introduces the Civil Rights Bill that becomes the Civil Rights Act of 64 eventually. There's a lot of ferment. This is George Wallace, the time George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, Medgar Evers assassination. So lots happening. And SNCC decides they want to be a part of this great gathering, even though as a more radical group, they're sort of cynical about this idea of promoting JFK's bill, which they have a lot of problems with. They see the deficiencies, the absences, the faults. So Lewis writes, and with others from SNCC, has ready to go this fairly militant barn burner of a speech. But the advanced text gets out, and a lot of people from the Kennedy Justice Department to people like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP are very unhappy with it because they think it's going to rain on the parade. By August, this March on Washington has kind of shifted from an angry protest to a kind of, happy, glorious fight for this bill that they think is going to have great consequence. So there's a kind of fight at the Lincoln Memorial itself under the shadow of Daniel Chester French's colossal Lincoln statue, as people like Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King are trying to convince John Lewis and the others from SNCC to tone down the speech. Finally, they arrive at a compromise, and I have the full story in all its kind of glorious detail in the book. But the compromise version, I think, actually speaks quite well to John Lewis. Some people say, he had to compromise or sell out or give in. You look at the final speech, it's still quite critical of the Kennedy bill. It's still quite assertive in demanding the things that have been left out. It's not, a happy go along to get along speech. And yet it's softened just enough that it doesn't take the sense of triumph or victory out of the day. And that sense of triumph is very important in helping the movement gain momentum and force throughout America, in the months and years ahead.
Lewis has this glorious youth, accomplishes a huge amount, but then he spends basically the whole second half of his life as an elected official, mostly as a member of Congress from Atlanta. Why does he end up making that transition, and is he successful at it?
Yeah, I mean, the story of how he goes from protest to politics is really at the heart of this book. And there's sort of a lot I could say about it. I even, I call part 1 protest and part 2 politics. It comes from an article of Bayard Rustin, who, I also discovered in my research was much more of a mentor to Lewis than I think people realized. And Rustin was advocating that after the success of the Civil Rights Act, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which of course Lewis was also critical in bringing about because of Selma, that it was important for the activists of the movement and other African Americans to go into elective politics, to now take advantage of what the Voting Rights Act was going to make possible, which was Black representation as mayors, as congressmen, in all kinds of office. It takes a while for Lewis to gain the confidence that he's the man to do it. He's shy. He always still saw himself kind of as the little boy from the farm. One story someone told me, even as a congressman, he meets the Queen of England and he comes back to the office wide-eyed. Can you believe this kid from, Troy, Alabama just met the Queen of England? So he always retains that sense of humility, but in part thanks to his wife, Lillian, who also really has not been written about much and who I learned a lot about in my research. She helps convince him to follow his ambitions, that he can have the confidence to pursue office. And he really, I think, does become an effective congressman. I mean, some people will say, well, he wasn't that much of a legislator or policy wonk, and there's some truth to that. But he did something else that was, in some ways, even more effective, which is he learned to leverage his moral authority, which, he had in droves, and put that behind the causes he believed in. And especially as he got older and younger members of congressmen came into the body, they would look to him. They would, when you vote, you can wait around to see how others have voted. Sometimes people would wait to see how John Lewis voted on a bill before casting their ballot.
What's an example of where he used his moral courage, not necessarily to write a bill, but to influence an outcome? Well,
one example comes fairly early in his congressional tenure. when George Bush Sr. is president. And, these days Bush gets kind of a warm and fuzzy makeover. People forget he was the first president since Andrew Johnson to veto a civil rights bill. That was in 1990. So the Democrats introduced the bill again in 1991. And Speaker of the House Tom Foley has just brought John Lewis into the Democratic Party leadership team, partly because he wants Lewis there to go to the White House to be a part of these meetings. And Lewis, relatively new congressman, kind of reads the riot act to George Bush Sr. and says, you're demagoguing this as a quota bill. We've put in language forbidding quotas. He really lays out the stakes, subtly reminding Bush of times that Bush, whether it was with the Willie Horton campaign against Dukakis, this sort of race baiting set of ads, or whether it was back in 1964 when Bush opposed the key civil rights bill of 1964. So he's kind of playing on Bush's guilt. And whether that alone swayed Bush or not, Bush ends up signing the 1991 civil rights bill. John Lewis's kind of moral jawboning may have made some of the difference.
This episode of Gabfest Reads is sponsored by GiveWell. GiveWell is a nonprofit that researches and recommends giving opportunities and is committed to maximizing the impact of donations. Each GiveWell recommendation is grounded in months of rigorous research and transparency to ensure your contribution has the greatest possible impact on the world. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they found. Over 125,000 donors, including me, have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. And rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving, so you can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. And when you make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Gabfest Reads at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Gabfest Reads to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
Come to me.
Focus Features invites you to succumb to the darkness.
Nosferatu.
From director Robert Eggers comes a masterpiece of horror.
He is coming.
This creature is a force more powerful than evil. It is death itself.
Nosferatu. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Special engagements in Dolby and IMAX.
This episode of Gabfest Reads is sponsored by Stars of David with Elon Gold. Stars of David with Elon Gold is a new podcast you'll want to check out. It's a brand new limited series, and it might be exactly what you need right now. The world can feel pretty heavy these days, but Elon Gold and his co-host Eli Leonard bring a fresh, funny perspective, showing that it's possible to laugh even when talking about the serious stuff. In Stars of David with Elon Gold, they sit down with Jewish guests who range from the familiar names to millennials and fresh voices of the Gen Z crowd who've made a real impact, whether fighting for justice or through comedy and laughter. It is the perfect mix of funny and meaningful. And what sets it apart is that it's unapologetically Jewish. There's comedy, there's culture, even a little kvetching thrown in for good measure. Stars of David with Elon Gold is for anyone who appreciates good humor, good conversation, and a new way of looking at the world. So subscribe now to Stars of David with Elon Gold wherever you listen to your podcasts, or head to Unpacked Podcasts on YouTube.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Streaming now on Peacock. Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie are back.
That's hot. Loves it.
For a show-stopping reunion that will prove putting on an opera is anything but simple.
We're really good at this.
One thing's for sure, they won't be upstaged.
Good to have you back. Come on, we've got a show to do.
Paris and Nicole, The Encore, a 3-part reunion special. Streaming now, only on Peacock.
Lewis gets elected to Congress in, it's 86, right, by running in the Democratic primary against his best friend, Julian Bond, another civil rights icon. Is that race reflect some sort of, deep ruthlessness in Lewis's character that we need to understand? Or was it really, he was still a gentle man who just happened to face an opponent who was somebody he knew well?
Well, I wouldn't call it a deep ruthlessness, but it does show John Lewis kind of maturing as a politician and recognizing that sometimes in politics, you do have to go negative, even against your best friend. And, John Lewis is at a point where he's being celebrated as a saint. And I think the book shows John Lewis was saintly. He had qualities like those Will Campbell described that most of us could never hope to approximate. But he wasn't a saint. He had flaws. He did things he regretted. He made some enemies. He disappointed some friends. I have a whole chapter on the Bond race, and it's really kind of just a great set piece unto itself. But it's kind of a tragic story. Both he and Julian Bond, friends of 25 years, they would travel together, vacation together with their wives and families. Neither one of them was ready to back out of that race when an open seat came in 1986 for Atlanta's 5th District. All of the elites lined up behind Bond because, as much as we know Lewis today as this icon, this celebrity, he wasn't really seen that way in 86. And back then it was Julian Bond, who hosted SNL and was in movies with Richard Pryor and was just, this handsome, dashing guy. But Lewis, one, he worked harder. He would be up at the factory gates at dawn, and he would be in the aisles of the 24-hour convenience stores at midnight. And he also knew, as many people in certain circles did, that Julian Bond had a pretty serious coke addiction. And this was a summer of Just Say No. It was a summer where voters were listing drugs as their number one issue. And Lewis's campaign managers would say to him, this isn't a cheap shot. Voters have a right to know if their elected official has a drug addiction. And Lewis, nonetheless, was reluctant to use the issue. But finally, on one occasion, after Bond comes after him in a debate with kind of a cheap shot on ethics, and if anyone was ethical, it was John Lewis. Lewis finally fires back and says, we should both go take a drug test. And that drug issue did become a major issue in the campaign and probably contributed to Lewis's upset victory later that fall.
So you talked about the saintliness of Lewis, the reputational saintliness of him. You studied him at 20 and you studied him at 70 late in life.
80. Yeah.
Is he, as a young man, he's quiet, he's brave, he's incorruptible, he is paragon of moral courage. Is he at 80 that same man? In what ways does he change from this young lion that he is?
Right. Well, I think he remains incorruptible. There's never really any sign of, real ethical compromise, but he does become a political creature, and he understands that to be a successful congressman, there is a different set of rules. Some people will take a dim view of all politicians. But if you're a believer in politics and you understand the codes of politics, you understand sometimes you have to vote for a bill that you're not entirely happy with because it's going to get you half of what you want or 2/3 of what you want. Sometimes you have to really go hammer and tongs against the political opponent in order to damage him, as Lewis did with a small group of Democrats against Newt Gingrich once the Republicans took control of Congress in the 90s. So he became more comfortable, I think, with the art of politics, the compromises of politics, you might say, all the while, I think, retaining a pretty good sense of his principles. I mean, some people from SNCC days, he did have people who criticized him, who said he became too comfortable with power and his radicalism softened and he should have been more adversarial toward the Democratic Party itself, because after all, he was now part of the leadership and close to Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and others. So if that's what you were looking for, maybe you would say, oh, the old firebrand John Lewis has softened. But I rather think that, he was someone who actually had the incredible accomplishment of succeeding wildly, first in the art of protest, and then secondly, in the art of politics.
So John Lewis was Black. He was a Southerner. He was Christian. You were white, a Northerner, and Jewish. How did that make it either challenging or easy for you to write about Lewis? And did you get pushback from people who thought that his biography should not be written by a white historian?
Remarkably, nobody raised that objection. I mean, the only time it's come up has been, like yourself, people asking it hypothetically on behalf of an imagined other person. And I sort of suspect that that's probably more true across, publishing and writing than perhaps we think, that there's maybe a fear of not trying to write the life of another. But that the number of people who would actually object, if you do it well, as I hope I have, pretty few. I mean, John Lewis gave me his blessing, his chief of staff, his family, all, whom are Black. I interviewed something like 275 people for this book, maybe half of them, I don't know, some large percentage were Black, and nobody seemed troubled by it. On the contrary, they were actually happy to have someone telling John Lewis's story.
What about the first part of the question, which is that you, in fact, perhaps the three of the signal qualities that he has, Christianity, his geographic roots, his race, are ones that you don't. And how did you approach that? How did you get past that?
Well, look, yeah, and I had to learn a lot. And there are some things that I will, I'm sure, never fully understand about, being a Black person in America, or being a Southerner or a Christian for that matter. But that's what historians do. That's what biographers do. I mean, if I were writing about Napoleon, I'm not a diminutive 19th century French general either. And, I would have to understand what that experience is like. And so, you interview people, in my case, hundreds of people. You read everything that John Lewis has said or written that you can get your hands on. You listen to his voice. You see the videos of him, and you immerse yourself in his life for about 5 years, as I did. And I think that has helped me see the world and understand the world as he did mostly. And, it's not, no human being can ever fully enter the mind of another human being. But with that kind of immersion, I think you can get close. How
much time did you get to spend with him?
I did not end up spending that much time with him personally. We had an initial meeting in 2019, and it was kind of peak John Lewis in the culture, because the week before he had done the coin toss at the Super Bowl in Atlanta. And then the next day after I met with him, he was flying to Los Angeles to go to the Oscars and introduce Green Book. So you have the Super Bowl and the Oscars, and then me wedged in on a Friday afternoon at 4:00. I got his blessing to do it. And he sort of said, well, this year is going to be very busy for me. I said, well, that's okay. I need to go to archives. I need to read all the secondary literature. But then later that year, at the end of 2019, he announced that they had discovered a tumor, pancreatic cancer. And then we had the pandemic. So I had a few phone interviews with him during the pandemic. He was getting chemotherapy, and I was not going to risk infecting, John Lewis and hastening his death. So we had some phone interviews, but I have to say, so much of what I learned about him and his account of things came from like these magnificent oral histories that I found in archives, including some in private archives. I mean, one friend of his who was a close friend going back to Nashville and worked with him for 20 years gave me his whole private archive, a guy named Archie Allen, who at one point had himself planned to write a Lewis biography. And, one day he called me, he lives now in Santa Barbara. He called me from the post office saying, "What's your credit card number? I want to send you 3 banker's boxes full of materials." And it was, these oral histories, but also his birth certificate, his high school transcript, his college acceptance letter. I mean, it was just a gold mine. So, there's a lot of different ways into understanding a person. And having been a journalist, now being a historian, I actually like that I could use kind of both sets of my skills, the interviewing, but also the historical digging. And I think together, especially for a figure of the recent past, it was almost the perfect combination.
What is the one thing you learned about Lewis or about Lewis's world that really most surprised you?
Oh, I mean, so many things. I mean, in a broad sense, I think I would say this aspect of his being such a canny political operator in ways that I hadn't envisioned. But there were other smaller things. I mean, for example, I've hardly had a chance to talk about this while talking about the book. He was a phenomenal collector of African-American art, and his home and office were filled with paintings and collages by people like Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. Many of these people became his friends. His staff would tell stories about driving through the backwoods of Georgia or Alabama to meet with folk artists, untutored, without formal training, some of whom have gone on to become quite recognized as accomplished Black artists. So just seeing sides of the man like that. I mean, I have a few pages on the art collecting. I could have written a lot more. Coming to see the man in full, beyond the public image of the saintly man, the conscience of the Congress, all of which is, I think, real, but it's just the surface. And there's a whole person underneath that I was trying to bring to readers.
Besides your wonderful biography, John Lewis, A Life, which you were not reading, what's another great new history book that other people should be reading?
I'm actually in the middle, or just starting 2 other terrific biographies of Black members of Congress, both of which I recommend to your listeners. One is by Mary Ellen Curtin on Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman from Texas, and one is by the historian Anastasia Curwood about Shirley Chisholm. And it's interesting that all 3 of these books have sort of come out around the same time. I think it shows a kind of maturation of the field of, what can we call it? Political history of Black Americans or Black political history. These are people whose accomplishments now are sufficiently in the past, but still relevant to the present, that we can study them historically. And we're getting a sense of just how fearless and groundbreaking a whole generation of African American leaders were in bringing about a very different face of politics in Washington.
Last question. What do you think John Lewis would have made of this return of Trump?
I'm always averse to ventriloquizing on the part of my subject. I don't, as well as I feel I know John Lewis, I can't speak for him. But, we do know what he said and did after Trump's election the first time. And it's actually quite relevant, and I think speaks to the moment. I mean, first, he was always counseling, do not get lost in a sea of despair. Keep the faith. don't give out, don't give up, don't give in. These were regular phrases he used. And he really believed in perseverance and continuing the fight. His own life story had told him that it's a long fight, that there are setbacks. There are points of discouragement. There are times where it feels like maybe it's going backward. But his ability to keep on keeping on, I think was really vital. And that was a message he was preaching a lot in 2017, 2018. And people responded. You know, I have one story shortly after the 2016 election, just random woman who happened to talk to a newspaper reporter was going through the Atlanta airport, just feeling beside herself, dejected after Trump's election. She sees John Lewis there in the airport, because he was often in the Atlanta airport, getting a shoe shine. He steps off the pedestal, comes down and gives her a hug. And she tells a reporter, I knew I was going to be okay. I knew America was going to be okay. And he had that almost magical religious quality for a lot of people. He was able to deliver a sense of hope and sustenance. And, I myself find that something I'm reaching for right now. And I think, maybe this book can help people find some of that sustenance now as well.
David Greenberg is the author of John Lewis, A Life, a wonderful biography of the civil rights icon and congressman. It also has an amazing cover photograph, which alone is probably doubling your sales. Just an astonishing photo of young John Lewis. David Greenberg, thanks for joining us on Gabfest Reads.
Thank you, David. Really a lot of fun. Thanks.
That's it for this month's edition of Gabfest Reads. Our producer, Cheyna Roth. Ben Richmond is Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is VP of Audio at Slate. We'll be back next month with another edition of Gabfest Reads. Until then, John and Emily and I will be back in your feed on Thursday with a new episode of the Slate Political Gabfest.
Happy holidays, everyone. Here at Slate, we take karaoke pretty seriously, especially around this time of year. So, for this holiday season, we are bringing that spirit straight to you with a special karaoke-themed episode of What Next Plus. You heard that right. I'm Mary Harris, the host of What Next, and I've teamed up with Anna Sale of Death, Sex, and Money to dive into the joy, chaos, and catharsis of karaoke. You're going to hear Slate staffers and friends share their ultimate go-to songs, from ballads that bring the house down to anthems for this moment we are living through right now. Plus, you'll get a playlist of barn burners and bops to sing along to at home. Head over to the What Next Plus feed and listen now.